It had been over 3 days since the power to Liz's house failed. You might think this would be a major cause for concern, but that was far from the worst thing that had occurred over this last tortuous month. It had been 2 weeks since martial law had been implemented, a citywide curfew now in effect to stop the free movement of people. Portland, they were told, was one of the few places to escape the worst of the virus, and these controls were essential to keep it that way. Those found breaking the curfew faced summary execution, no matter what valid excuse they might think they had. Man or woman, if you broke the rules, you were deemed a threat and ruthlessly eliminated. Of course, it was typically women affected by this because most of the men had gone. That was the way it had to be, they were told. The same went for the political agitators, the rebellious, and those who chose to break the many laws that were previously used to control people's lives. There was no tolerance now. Either you did as you were told, or you were deemed unfit for what was left of the world. Desperate times call for desperate measures, you see. That was what the talking heads on the limited number of TV and radio channels had told everyone. And on the whole, the population acquiesced, because the military was the only chance they had to survive this nightmare. New York had been the first city to fall, though the origins of the virus were unknown. Nobody expected it, nobody predicted it, and when it finally appeared, nobody had a clue how to defeat it. It was a silent menace at first, spreading through the population of the East Coast, hardly presenting as anything more worrying than mild cold-like symptoms. People were heard to complain that there was a bug going around, passing from person to person, throughout schools and hospitals, with colleagues infecting the people they worked with. Just a handshake was all it took, or a kiss from a loved one. A cough on a subway could infect dozens. The very air you exhaled could be home to millions of viral particles that floated on the wind, ready to contaminate anything they encountered, anything human mind. The virus didn't survive in any other species. Then the change came, and everybody's world fell to pieces. The prime responders were the ones worst hit, catching the virus from those they interacted with and spreading it on to further victims. With a 3-day incubation period, the virus was all the way across the city and the East Coast before anyone even knew what hit them. By the time the president was informed that there was a new virus going around, her entire cabinet was already infected. The president, being female, might have survived the virus, but the men weren't so lucky. The men who were guarding her. The men who ultimately ripped her to pieces. That was the way the virus worked. The plague infected both sexes, but it only changed the males. As the virus slowly ravaged the host's immune system, the very body itself began to change. At the 3-day mark, infected males stopped being human beings when their DNA mutated to allow a new species to rapidly evolve. These new atoms didn't reproduce sexually. Instead, they created more of their kind via a much more unpleasant method, and they killed any female they could find. Male Homo sapiens warped into an entirely new species through mutation of their Y chromosome. To the women, the virus was no worse than flu. The first of the infected became Homo vampirus at 11:13 p.m. on the 7th of June in a small and sparsely furnished apartment in Queens, New York City. Arthur Miller had been his name, an unassuming accounting clerk whose sole claim to fame prior to the virus was that he had once stood behind Robert De Niro in a Starbucks. He was a nobody, a worker drone who went to a job he hated so that he could fulfill the tasks given to him by people who cared nothing for him. Just another face in the crowd of 8.5 million people. He hadn't even been worthy of ridicule. Nobody was there to witness his transformation, an event so violent and rapid that it drew the disapproval of the neighbors in the property below. Those neighbors, despite deciding to keep their objections to themselves, were soon overcome by Arthur, who went from apartment to apartment, spreading the seed of the planet's destruction. By the time a policeman's bullet finally ended Arthur's rampage, he had infected over 27 men. All the women he encountered he killed mercilessly, ripping flesh from them so he could bathe in their blood. All those 27 men followed Arthur on the murderous rampage he had started. The transformed became known as virals. Thousands changed in the span of a few hours, millions in the span of a few days. Across America, human civilization quickly began to fall apart. That was how they lost the hospitals, The injured and the unwell ferried to those bastions of medicine that rapidly became central breeding grounds for the plague. Whatever the changes to humanity's DNA caused by the virus, it made the virals strong, durable, and allowed for regeneration of all but the severest of injuries. It also made them crazed for the taste and the consumption of human blood, especially those of females who were hunted down in their droves. Despite the best efforts of the government, the onslaught of the virus was too great to be kept secret for very long. Even with internet restrictions that nobody ever thought would be needed, word got out before the lid could be put on it. Through social media and the dark web, the reality of what virals were was released to the world, and the world shook with the enormity of it all. What male could be trusted after that? Faced with a viral, those with the means often ended their own lives rather than being forced to become part of the growing horde. Better to die than become one of those things, was the general consensus. Better to end it all than be eaten alive and drained of blood as the last spark of life drained from you. Suicida skyrocketed. Understandable, really, when you thought about it. Existence hadn't been that appealing to many as it was, and now the apocalypse had arrived. There was also a misunderstanding over what the virals were. In the beginning, it was thought that they were just partaking in a mindless whirlwind of insanity and infection. It soon became apparent that the virals rarely killed the men they attacked, only the women. They would gouge and bite and rip the eyes from people's skulls, but the majority of those males dined on would be kept alive until the virus changed them. Even more surprising was that, as the number of virals grew, the females would often be left unharmed until an area was cleared of all opposition. Only then would former husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers return to the places they called home. Then, the feasting would begin. Other animals on the planet didn't fare so well. There was no sparing them, though the virus only affected human DNA. Cattle, household pets, and even the rats that scuttled in the streets all became food for a creature whose sole purpose seemed to be to strip all life from the planet. The hunger of the virals was ravenous, their stomachs sometimes distending with the volume they consumed. Occasionally, a male naturally immune to the virus would be encountered. They would be ripped to pieces so that no remnant of their rejection remained to threaten the new order that was taking control. At first, the scientists thought that Homo vampirus was a rabid, insane creature, incapable of reasoning or conscious thought. It soon became apparent that, whilst many of them did not speak, the virals did in fact communicate. Everything they did soon revealed itself to be coordinated and calculated, with the virals acting in the way that best helped propagate their growing species. Seemingly mindless attacks suddenly revealed their strategic purpose, with the military quickly becoming overwhelmed by the forces legioned against them. Rumors began to flow that there was a hierarchy amongst the vampires, that some had retained much of their human consciousness. Nobody seemed to know for sure. What they did know was that it took mere days for humanity to be brought to its knees. As bad as it seemed, there was worse to come. The first change had occurred just under a month ago, with the news media barely even realizing the nightmare that was growing. The government knew, though, as had governments all across the planet, because it wasn't just America that saw an outbreak. Every major country began reporting the rise of the virals, an unstoppable tsunami of death washing across the planet. When the truth about the virus finally couldn't be suppressed any longer, it was already too late. That was when the cities began to fall, the virus spreading across the land, driven by the relentless hordes that had been created. Military might couldn't stop it, and neither could science. Washington fell before the nukes could be deployed quickly enough. By the time New York and Boston had become smoking, radioactive ruins, the plague had spread too far to be suppressed by such weapons of mass destruction. If anything, the resulting radiation seemed to strengthen the virals. Those caught outside the blast zone quickly recovered from their injuries, their skin thickening as if to counteract the future use of such weapons. As amazing as it seemed to the soldiers fighting on the ground, the monsters they faced became even tougher. In some cases, the skin became impervious to anything except armor-piercing rounds. That was the other thing about the virals. Their DNA was so enhanced that their bodies adapted to the threats hurled against them. The doctors called it the HV13N5 virus. Everyone else called it the Nosferatu plague, because that was effectively what it turned people into. Vampires, vamps, bloodsuckers, and leeches. Virals. A dozen names arrived to mark the ambassadors of the apocalypse. Only sunlight didn't kill them, and garlic had no adverse effects. Religious symbols were about as useful as a fly swatter against a hurricane. Most of the folklore had been wrong about vampires, made up stories about a creature that, until now, had never actually existed. The vampires of today existed to suck the blood from the living and consume the flesh to nourish themselves. Then there was their secondary purpose, which appeared to be to spread the virus that demanded to control the world. Everyone remembered the first time they heard about the virus. For Liz, she had been outside the school gates waiting for her child to be discharged from the private school she and John paid too much money for. It was worth it to keep their darling out of the public school system, but it was a severe stretch on their finances. There were no stereotypical metal detectors or armed police roaming the halls of this school, so they figured it was worth it. Every child who marched out of the main doors was dressed in the regimental school uniform, the height of order and decorum, and the education about as good as money could buy. "Did you hear about the rioting in New York?" The question came from one of the mothers standing next to Liz. Of course, it hadn't been rioting, not of the kind most people expected. It had been a swarm of vampires overpowering the streets and the subways to spread their viral seed all across the city. Within 2 days, the school had closed its doors, insisting that all children stay at home due to the growing national emergency. By then, all the supermarkets had been stripped clean, and there were soldiers on the streets. That was when John had insisted they pack some bags and head into the hills away from the city. Being a firefighter, he had a sense of how things were on the streets of Portland. He knew bad things were coming, despite the platitudes and the reassurances on the TV that Liz now paid ample attention to. Liz hadn't listened to his pleadings, and this was a shame that constantly threatened to overpower her. If Liz had taken heed of what John had said, maybe he would still be alive. Maybe she and her daughter wouldn't be here being marched to the illusion of some sanctuary somewhere along with hundreds of other women. "Give it another day," Liz had said, frightened of what abandoning the relative normality of their lives would mean. Reluctantly, John had agreed to her wishes, only for her husband to be conscripted the next day. The men came in the early hours, brandishing the presidential executive order and enough force of arms to stop any kind of meaningful resistance. John was marched off with the rest of the husbands and fathers on her street. They even took all the boys over 16 as well, so desperate was the situation. Liz had choked back the carnage in her thoughts that told her she would never see the man she loved again. Ruby never even got to say goodbye to her father. They had told her that she was safe so long as she did what she was told. That was a lie, like everything else. Then the power failed, and then the soldiers came again. Only this time there were no men left to take. On that fateful morning, Liz had been woken by the sound of the city's disaster sirens. That could only mean one thing: the city she lived in was close to being overrun. That noise would forever fill her with dread. Just the memory of it sent fear coursing through her nervous system. Liz would come to fear a lot of things as the days progressed.